Good evening. My name is Lincoln Chen. I'm at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies, and it gives me great honor to welcome you to this ARCO forum this evening on From Somalia to Cambodia, NGOs and the International System. The question naturally arises, why is a population center collaborating with the Kennedy School and HID in sponsoring such a forum? We at the Population Center have operated for the last year a program on human survival and security as part of our interest in furthering human survival, human well-being, particularly in times of complex political crisis. And in response, international civil society often operate through non-governmental organizations and, of course, the international system of the United Nations family of agencies. It's the reinvigoration and the new institutional arrangements that are of great interest in our international response to these crises, and naturally, we turned to the program on non-governmental organizations of the Harvard Institute for International Development to organize and host this occasion. Another reason for the collaboration, of course, is that I'm Lincoln Chen, and the director of that NGO program is Marty Chen. Marty?
Thank you, Lincoln. I would like to mention a couple of other institutional sponsors of tonight's panel presentation. The Edward S. Mason program at both HID and the Kennedy School is a co-sponsor, as well as something called IDPIC, which is the International Development Professional Interest Council here at the Kennedy School, a student professional interest group. I'd also like to thank, on behalf of all the sponsors, two people who made all of this possible. One of them is Carol Grodzins, who is the coordinator of our program on non-governmental organizations. And the other is, I'm looking for it, Winifred Fitzgerald, who is the assistant director at the Center for Population and Development Studies and a colleague of Lincoln's. Our speakers tonight include 4 heads of U.S. NGOs, albeit different kinds: Mary Anderson, John Hammack, Andrew Nazios, and Julia Taft, and a great privilege, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations for Humanitarian Affairs, Jan Eliason. And they have been asked tonight to explore with us the political, logistical, moral dilemmas faced by international NGOs as they seek to provide humanitarian assistance in complex conflict situations, dilemmas relating to such questions as whether and under what conditions should NGOs operate without the concurrence of local governments, without a legitimate mandate from the international community, and without perhaps complying with international humanitarian law. We've also asked them to consider whether and under what circumstances should NGOs get involved as mediators and negotiators in seeking to bring about an end to hostilities. And we've asked them to explore what types of roles NGOs have played and should play in relationship to the UN agencies involved in peacekeeping and/or humanitarian assistance. The format for this evening's panel presentation is that each panelist will speak for roughly 10 minutes. After all the panelists have spoken, I will open up the floor for questions. That's our format. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first panelist this evening, Mary Anderson. Dr. Anderson is president of a Boston area NGO called Collaborative for Development Action, which is involved in technical assistance and training to a wide range of international development agencies. Her one specialty among many that it relates particularly to this evening's discussion is that she has written a book that includes a conceptual framework and case materials on how we might think of the relationship of relief and development, whether when we go in to do relief assistance, we can have development outcomes. And she is now extending that framework to think about when we do relief and development assistance, whether we can have local peace outcomes. Mary has extensive connections with Harvard University. She has been on the faculty of HIID. She has been on the faculty of the School of Education. She was acting director at the Bunting Institute at Radcliffe College. She also has extensive NGO connections. She is a member of the board of the American Friends Service Committee, and she has networked and trained a wide range of NGOs. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I appreciate this opportunity to be in a group like this. I should say, when Marty referred to the work that we did on the relief development continuum, that I worked with a colleague who's many of you know, whose name is Peter Woodrow, and some of the material I'm drawing on tonight comes out of that study as well, so I should give him the credits and the blame for things that you agree or disagree with me on some of those issues. Humanitarian assistance arises, according to my dictionary, from the disposition to do good. But if humanitarian assistance today contributes to a famine tomorrow, can it be considered truly humanitarian? If humanitarian assistance is distributed generously, and then later studies come back and they show that households headed by women receive none of the assistance, can it be considered truly humanitarian? If humanitarian assistance to civilians in war populations, in war zones, must rely on armed representatives of the warring parties in order to gain access to the civilians and thereby legitimate the right of those arms to give them or deny them access to those people, or if humanitarian assistance to reach civilians in war situations need to rely on third parties, such as US or UN or other government troops, in order to reach civilians, and sometimes the result is that there are exchanges of firepower, and sometimes civilians get killed as a result of those troops' presence, is that truly humanitarian assistance? These are the kinds of questions that humanitarian agencies at all levels, NGOs up through the international humanitarian assistance, are dealing with these days. They're complex, real, and important questions, and they don't have easy answers, and we are all grappling with them all the time, and they seem to get harder instead of easier the more we grapple with them. In the next few minutes that are allotted to me, I'm going to address those kinds of questions and try to get some handle on them a bit by asking three other questions, which are more set a framework for how to think about the issues. The first question I'm going to ask is, what is the responsibility of humanitarian assistance? Second question I'm going to ask is, what are the limits of humanitarian assistance? And the third question I'm going to ask is, given what I say about responsibilities and limits, then what? What can we do about that? Okay, what are the responsibilities of humanitarian assistance? I posit that as a minimum responsibility, humanitarian assistance has the responsibility to do no harm while it is seeking to do good. Humanitarian assistance is usually defined as immediate emergency assistance to victims of some kind of disaster, some kind of emergency that has caused them to have immediate physical needs. People are hungry, we get food to them. People are sick or they're injured, we get emergency medical services to them. People are cold and exposed, we get shelter, tents, clothing, blankets, things to people in physical need. It's a beautiful idea that you can respond immediately to people who have some need. An old Quaker, Clarence Pickett, once said, the principle of humanitarian assistance is the delivery of a cup of cool water to a thirsty person. Thirsty man, he said. It's a long time ago. It's a pure thought, and it doesn't work out that way, as we all know. Let me just trace some of the things that happen, give some illustrations to set our context for the difficulty of these questions tonight. We all know, it's a familiar example. You provide food in a disaster situation where people are hungry, and indeed it drives the prices of food down in that country, which in the first instance is good, because then poorer people can have access to that food and can feed themselves, and so you begin to meet the need for food very quickly, both through free food and driving the price down. What happens, of course, is that the incentives to farmers who grow food go down as well. They don't plant the next crop because if they do, they can't sell it, and so there's no reason for them to do it, which then is laying the groundwork and building the seeds either for future dependency on further international assistance or the next humanitarian crisis of famine. Another example, that's a familiar one. Another example comes from Ethiopia, also a famine situation, but it takes it a step further. From the mid-'80s, some of you heard me tell this story before, but it so poignantly captures what we're talking about. There was a horrible famine. There were many people dying. We knew it. There was a need for food, and so tonnage was shipped by many international organizations. The issue was urgency. How can we get food to these people before they die? An Ethiopian reflecting upon the situation after the fact in a newspaper interview said, you know, those international troops looked like an occupying army of the well-intentioned. He described the scene of those troops going across, those trucks of food going across the desert at night, each with a guard on it with guns, walkie-talkies connecting them, the logistics issue was up, and they were working to get that food out as rapidly and as efficiently as possible. In the concern and rush to try to meet physical needs under a time limitation and an sense of urgency, the international agencies, all of us, most of us, not 100%, fortunately, but a lot of us forgot to take account of the social fabric of Ethiopian society, the organizational capacities of Ethiopian people to handle those things, and we imported not only food but also systems for distribution and systems for accountability. And this same Ethiopian who reflected on that said at the end, you know, the sad thing about that famine was not that so many people died from hunger, which was extraordinarily sad. The really sad thing about that famine was that Ethiopians learned that the solutions for all our problems come from outside. That's a further outcome from an immediate solution. Quotes. One more example. In Cambodia, I'm told by someone who recently spent several months there that one of the things that's happening is as follows, and that is that NGOs who worked in the Thai border camps with displaced refugees from Cambodia did a lot of training, long-term development thrust to this. They trained people to be teachers, to be health workers, to be social workers, and so on, and so these people had a variety of new capacities and new abilities when they went back. I am told that now some of those same NGOs who are working in Cambodia are refusing to hire those people that they trained. And the reasons that they're giving for refusing to hire them, according to my informant, is that they understand that the clients with whom they're working on the ground in Cambodia, those people who stayed and did not become refugees and leave, resent those people because they had advantages in the camps. And so they can't hire them because they have to honor this resentment. I understand that. That is a problem in any returning repatriation situation where people are coming back. The problem here is that these NGOs, by making that choice, I think, and my person who told me this thinks, are exacerbating the problem. They're legitimating this tension. And instead of finding a creative way to overcome that tension and do something about it, they're choosing up sides with the people who stayed and advocating for them. The fact is that immediate solutions to short-term emergency problems often have negative long-term outcomes, long-term consequences. They put into motion a set of things that happen that create negative outcomes. They are responsible for those, and therefore I claim that humanitarian assistance agencies and those of us who are concerned about it must assume that responsibility for the long-term outcomes of our short-term efforts. And we must be held accountable for the long-term outcomes of our short-term efforts. We cannot be satisfied with saving lives in the short term when the outcomes in the longer term are negative. I'll come back to what we can do about that. The second question is that I wanted to ask is, what are the limits of humanitarian assistance? Well, let me posit that the limits of humanitarian assistance are as follows. While doing some good, humanitarian assistance cannot bring goodness. I mean, let's remember that we have to be humble about what it is we're doing. We're trying to contribute to some process of good that's going on in this world, but we won't make the world right by the way in which we do humanitarian assistance. International assistance cannot make everything right. No one ever develops anyone else. People in societies have to develop themselves. People who work on development issues have to support the capacities of people in a situation to develop themselves. Similarly, nobody ever makes anybody else's peace. People in societies have to make the conditions for their own peace and achieve their own reconciliation. Outsiders cannot make insiders' development, and outsiders cannot bring peace to insiders. That's a reality and puts a limit on what we're talking about in terms of humanitarian assistance. Our actions need to be in support of local people to achieve their own development and their own peace, And that doesn't mean a completely passive or a non-questioning position, but it does mean that one has to be supportive rather than importing. We do not import development, and we do not import peace to other places. Given what I've said then about some of the negative outcomes of long-term outcomes of short-term humanitarian efforts, and also given this fact that I've said we need to take responsibility for those, and given these two limits that we really can't do it for someone else, we're really supporters in a process, what are the kinds of options we have? What can we do? Should we just say if we need to be sure that we get our humanitarian assistance completely right before we do anything? And the answer, I think, to that has to be no, because that poses another humanitarian problem. How can we refuse to respond to people's needs when we have the ability to do so? So we must keep going forward, and we must keep trying. Just let me say that right out front. So what do we do? What then are our possibilities? Well, we know that there are many, many ways in which you can support long-term development by even while meeting initial immediate emergency needs of people in humanitarian emergencies. The project that I referred to that I did with a coworker here looked at that continuum, and we found example after example after example, some of them represented by the NGOs in this room, of ways in which people had successfully supported long-term development even while they gave blankets or fed hungry people or had provided emergency health care in a short-term way. And the way they did that, by and large, was by not becoming so fixated on the material thing. That is, that they gave the material assistance that they did with the following understanding. They said, what are these people doing to cope with their own disaster, and how are they doing it? How can we be supportive of their effort to respond to their own crisis and their own disaster? The agencies that do uniformly badly come in and they say, these poor victims, they can do nothing for themselves, let us do it for them because they're wiped out by what's going on and they have no capacities. And that produces the negative outcomes. The positive outcomes come in the other direction. An example arises from the Ethiopian situation, where one of the agencies said, we'll bring food into the area and we'll bring it to a certain place, but you're responsible for distributing it. And so people built roads back into the countryside. Ethiopians, victims, built roads back into the countryside, organized donkey trains and so on, and got the food back. Other examples, however, on the peace issue. What can we do about peace? Let me just quickly touch on two or three. We can, NGOs and others operating in the agency in the areas, by the positions that they hold in close to the ground and with people, can do several things. They can create some neutral space in which people can mediate, can negotiate. They can do some mediation. They can carry messages back and forth. They can establish safe zones. They can establish safe days, as UNICEF has for inoculations. These are all the kinds of things that can be done, and they can be done in addition to the humanitarian work. The further question to ask is, how can we design, by the way we give it, the humanitarian assistance, so that it recognizes tensions, addresses them, and in fact helps alleviate them. I want to give one quick example from Cambodia, since I gave a bad example there, and that has to do with UN High Commissioner for Refugees' work right now, is providing something called QIPs, Quick Impact Projects. There's a small amount of money in which people in communities can come forward and say, we need X amount of money to dig a well because with the returnees coming back from the refugees coming back and repatriating, the burden on the resources is too great, and we need to do something about that. There is a suggestion on their books right now to do this, and I don't know if they're doing it or not, and that is that they have a window for such loans in which people who come who represent both people who stayed in Cambodia and people who returned to come together. And they say, we want to do this project together, and we're going to work on it to do this thing to build our community together. That'd be a preferred window. They're doing what they were doing anyway, but they're rewarding people for building colleagueship and finding how to use each other's assets to rebuild the nation, instead of legitimating the tensions that exist there and refusing to acknowledge them. It's a kind of an example. There are more to be had, I'm sure. What we're doing actually is looking for them. One reason this doesn't happen as much is because we haven't given it enough thought, and because we're not held accountable to it. We must do both. We must give it a lot more thought, and we must work systems of accountability that keep us responsible for long-term outcomes from our short-term work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker is John Hammack. John is the Executive Director of Oxfam America since 1984. Most of you know that Oxfam America is a U.S. NGO that funds indigenous NGOs in many poor countries in the developing world. John is an expert on economic and community development. One of his former jobs was as the executive director of Action International, which many of you are also familiar with. John has firsthand experience with drought in Ethiopia, war and drought in Mozambique, hunger in Vietnam and Cambodia. He recently visited Bangladesh and El Salvador. And one interesting detail, he was born and raised in Havana, Cuba. Another interesting detail for me is that he was my boss for 3 years. Welcome, John.
Marty was one of our star people. Let me tell you, it was tough to lose Marty. Michelle Ferrier is hungry. She lives in Haiti. And we see her image on TV. And what do we want to do right away? You feel bad for that woman on TV that's starving. So you figure we want to send her some food. So the question you ask yourself is, how can I get that person some food in the quickest and most efficient manner? And bingo, you've got a problem. Because that's what NGOs do sometimes. And the question itself is the problem. Because then, how do you answer that question? You get some food, you get something to send it over there, and you get somebody to distribute it. Solve the problem. She's no longer starving. Everybody goes home happy. Your donor that gave you the $25 figures you solved the problem. The U.S. government that gave you the $1 million food is happy because the food was dealt with and the problem was solved. Wrong. Wrong. What happens when that happens? You have basically taken a major step in the wrong direction. Because the issue isn't that Michelle Ferrier is starving today only. The issue is that she's going to continue to starve again and again and again unless we deal with the underlying problems. I don't buy the fact that there's a difference between relief and development. We are in the business of developing people and developing societies. Relief is just one step along the way, and anybody who thinks of it as an end step is wrong and is going to fail. There's several problems that are inherent in the way we do relief work. One is we use food from the outside. Most places there's plenty of food around the corner, either in the next country or in the neighboring city sometimes, or in the same basic area. But we're trying to get rid of our surplus food. Secondly, we come in and we have the answers, so we destroy local capability. Sometimes we hire local people, but not very often. And we create dependency, because all of a sudden they like our wheat. All of a sudden we don't leave either. We stay there too long. And if you stay there too long, you know what happens? You have a nice job for a while, but you know what happens? You start to break down local systems even further. All of a sudden, what Mary says is absolutely true. Food prices begin to, you have a problem with food production, because food prices can't compete with free food. So a farmer says, and this happened in Somalia this time around, where food that was put in the ground was having a hard time being sold because there was still food coming in for free. Oftentimes I wonder if colonialism doesn't have new agents overseas. And sometimes I really question whether NGOs are really NGOs, or whether we should be talking about PGOs, or P whatever they are. And that is paragovernmental organizations. Because many NGOs are not private. And many NGOs follow government policy to the T. It seems to me that the type of development that Mary was talking about a minute ago is the kind of solutions that all of us have to have. We all have to be development agencies. And that the way that you do development and relief together is that you make a long-term commitment to a country, you have long-term partners in that country, and if there is a disaster that strikes that country, you work through the partners that you've been working with for the last 5 or 10 years. You don't make fly-by-night decisions to go into a country. And once you're in a country, you find those partners, you work with those partners, you cultivate them and make them work. The same type of local, small-scale development efforts are possible when we talk about peace. In Somalia today, the UN's doing a great job trying to get people together at the top levels to talk about peace. It's essential to go to the community level, to talk to community people, to get community people to start talking peace, and that's happening. But it's happening with small amounts of money, and it certainly is not happening with a lot of United Nations assistance. The United Nations has an incredible role to play, I believe, in the future of this world. Unfortunately, and I think Jan well understands this, and let me just say that Jan has been a battler on the side of humanitarian assistance inside the UN. But the UN is a den of incredible bickering, politics, and fiefdoms. And it seems to me that one of the things that has to happen at the UN is that the Department of Humanitarian Affairs needs to be given some power. It took them years to even get an office. And one time I went there, they were struggling around for a desk. What kind of power were they given? They were given a mandate, but a limited mandate. Why? Because there are too many organizations at the United Nations doing humanitarian assistance, competing with each other and trying to get the glory and keeping the power. Seems to me that's got to be reformed if we're going to have change that's going to be meaningful for poor people. There are too many agencies, there are too many bureaucrats, there are too many technicians that want to have the answers be by experts. Experts don't have the answers to development, people do. And if that one thing could be understood by people at the UN and by development agencies, we'd be a lot further along. But it's not understood. And also at the United Nations, traditional solutions are being peddled overseas, just like they are out of most large international agencies like the World Bank, AID, and the IMF. For example, one of the things that's going to make things work in Somalia is if we ask people to participate. Local people, people at the community level, get together to solve their differences. It has happened, and it is happening. But it's happening outside of the TV camera. It's happening outside of the United Nations. Unfortunately, the United Nations perhaps always will be, as long as it is an organization of nations, too tied to politics and to the domination of certain countries. But let me turn to politics, because I believe that all development is political. Any organization that tells me that they're apolitical and that their work is totally apolitical, it's hogwash. Anytime you do anything in the third world, it's political. And oftentimes when you wrap yourself in the mantle of being apolitical, what you're doing is you're being used by somebody, sometimes inadvertently, but sometimes you know who's using you, but you go ahead and do it anyway because it's part of your job. And you don't think about the end result of being used. But let me say that advocacy is a major component of an NGO, an international NGO, if it's going to survive in today's world. An NGO that hides underneath the rug and goes for cover is not, I believe, doing the job that needs to be done. We need to change the United Nations. We need to change USAID. We need to change the World Bank and IMF policies that are killing people all over the world. They're not helping people all over the world. If you look at people who are poor, structural adjustment is doing them in. Peddled by who? By the World Bank and the IMF. The United Nations is also part of the problem. And many NGOs hide from that fact and hide from the reality that they've got to participate as advocates. We are advocates for the poor. An international NGO that shies away from that, I believe, is shirking its responsibility. The world is in a moment of tremendous crisis, tremendous upheavals going on in this world. It seems to me very clear. If you're a partner with an agency in El Salvador, and that partner in El Salvador is being shot, and that's happening today. That didn't stop, okay? There are people being shot in El Salvador as we speak. Some of them Oxfam partners. And if Oxfam shies away and says, oh, sorry now, can't go with you because we were only interested in drinking that little well over there, what kind of partners are we? We have to stand up with them when they're getting beaten. And if they're trying to change their society, they will be beaten because they're looking for change. They're not looking for the same pablum. We need to be able to stand with the poor and stand strong with the poor. And if that means going to Haiti and standing up and saying, I am here and I want to be counted, so be it. And if it means going to El Salvador and saying, we do not accept people being killed, and if you want to kill us all, so be it. But I've gotten older, and maybe it's because I've been around too long, but I'll tell you one thing, traditional solutions don't work. And unless we're willing to stand with the poor, stand tall with the poor, stand together with the poor, until it hurts, we're not going to have change in this world. And by God, this world needs change. Because let me tell you, the gap between the rich and the poor is going bigger in this country, it's bigger overseas, and the gap between the rich countries and the poor countries is wider than ever before, and it's getting worse. And it's not going to get any better unless we decide, you and me, to say enough is enough. We're going to try to change that. And we can change it. If you talk to poor people overseas and you talk to people who are in communities overseas, they want change. But they need people like us, not to sit in our ivory towers at Harvard, not to sit in our ivory towers at NGOs, not to sit in our ivory towers at the United Nations. We need to act, and we need to act together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I've traveled with John in rural India, and I'm glad to see he's himself, whether it's rural villages or ivory towers. Our next speaker is Andrew Nazios, who is the Vice President of World Vision USA and the Executive Director of World Vision Relief and Development. And in those capacities, he's responsible for program design and allocation of some $100 million for relief and development in developing countries in Eastern Europe and in the newly independent states. He's also responsible for World Vision's relationship with the US government and the UN. In the past, from 1991 to 93, he was the Assistant Administrator in USAID in the Bureau for Food and Humanitarian Assistance. And more closely, from 1975 to 1987, he was State Representative, Massachusetts House of Representatives. And more closer still, in 1979, he graduated from the Kennedy School of Government with an MPA. So, Andrew.
I've been trying to conjure up some sense of nostalgia for this building, but only a small amount of it has come to me this evening. I did go back to the House of Representatives today to see if my old seat is still there, and it is. It was held by Calvin Coolidge. So I don't mean the district, I mean the seat. In 1909, he had the same seat in the House of Representatives I did. I remembered that today, and he was president. I'm out of office now. Okay, let me tell you what I'd like to talk about. I've been talking about Somalia almost continuously for the last few months, and I'm kind of fed up with it. Not with Somalia, but just with talking about it. So I changed my speech or my remarks about 15 minutes ago, and I'm going to give different remarks than what I had initially planned, because I'm just tired of speaking about the same subject. Right now, we are facing, in my view, in the so-called New World Order, or the order of things that has succeeded as the Cold War has ended, a great challenge in what we call complex humanitarian emergencies, CHEs. When I started at OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which is the principal coordinator and funder of relief programs with cash, food goes through another office in AID. Julia Taft is the former director, and I'm told that another ghost from times past, my predecessor at OFDA, is here somewhere. I don't see him, Jim Kunder, the new vice president of Save the Children. So 3 former directors are here this evening, and we lived and ate the subject of relief during a long period of very tumultuous times. When I started at OFDA, our annual budget was, spending, not budget, was $48 million. When I left, it was $200 million. When Julia Taft started as the director of OFDA, the average number of complex emergencies each year, beginning from 1978 to 85, on the average was 5 a year. Last year there were 17. Our early warning system that we're beginning to develop this year in World Vision, we estimate there will be 20 by the end of next year. There are people who will tell you in Washington, outside and inside government, that Somalia and Bosnia and Haiti are exceptions. They are unusual circumstances, and we should not take too many precedents from them, which I think is utter nonsense. And the reality is this may well be one of the central challenges to the foreign policy of our country as well as other countries in the developed world, as well as those countries that face the crises in the developing world. What is a complex emergency? It is an emergency involving civil strife, ethnic, religious, racial, where there is massive economic collapse, not a rise in the unemployment rate, but 60, 70, 80% unemployment, where there is drought, all combined together to create a situation where people's coping mechanisms collapse and there is mass starvation, as we saw in Somalia a year and a half ago. The number of people who AID fed in these complex emergencies through the food programs they run through NGOs and the UN system and the ICRC was 58 million people at risk of starvation in complex emergencies in the last fiscal year. So this is an extraordinary problem that we are facing, and we need to deal with it. What is the existing international system for dealing with complex emergencies? Well, I'm not either criticizing or defending the existing system. I'm going to describe it very briefly. First, whether we like it or not, the UN is in a major leadership role in coordinating these emergencies. The UN serves through the operational agencies. There are 4 operational agencies, basically: the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Program, and UNICEF. Those are the fundamentally large, major operational agencies in complex emergencies. The reality is, though, they are operational, though, in a very broad sense. Very few of those agencies actually go in and deliver services in villages where people are dying or starving or suffering from an epidemic or in the middle of atrocities created during a civil war, for example. The reality is, in most cases, their resources, commodities or cash, go through NGOs. So the UN works basically at to use a crass parallel, at a wholesale level, while NGOs work at the retail level. The UNICEF will give us, in the NGO community, the medication to inoculate children in the villages, and then we will physically do the inoculations working with people in the villages that we're in. The larger international NGOs, in fact, do work through either indigenous NGOs that are independent, or in the case, for example, of World Vision, we are an interdenominational Christian NGO. We work with any Christian church at the local level that we think legitimate, we, regardless of denomination, but we also work through what increasingly are independent World Vision boards of directors in the countries in the third world. Most of our staff, we have 27,000 employees worldwide. I would guess 85, 90% are third world people. Many of them who are on the boards of directors of these of World Vision chapters in the countries that we work in are major figures. In fact, I was thinking of it the other day. If you looked at the people who serve in our boards in the third world, they are far more prominent in their countries than those of us who run World Vision in the United States or the developed world. The people in Africa, for example, who sit in our boards are major figures in the country and well known by the average person. And that makes our relationships among the partnership, as we call it, difficult and challenging and interesting. The major international NGOs, therefore, work through indigenous NGOs that are independent or NGOs that they've created that are part of an international partnership. Now, and there's been a movement in many of the NGOs to decentralize their operations to the country level with people from the third world running things. Now, the reality is that a lot of the funding comes from USAID, from the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and from Food for Peace in terms of food commodities. But the NGOs also raise money on their own. So the source of funding for most of these efforts in complex emergencies are either AID or the American public or the UN, but the UN, of course, gets its money from countries that are members. Now, what are the strengths of the system as it exists now? Well, it's polycentric and it's decentralized. And you can imagine in any system, any institution that has those characteristics has certain strengths and weaknesses. The first is that there's enormous pluralism, which I think is good in terms of doctrines and ideas and how you deal, the institutions you deal with. I mean, we work through churches and we develop, educate, work with in terms of training, administrative procedures, management procedures in local churches to work with them so that they have a capacity to run things on their own. That's very useful, I think, the transfer of that kind of information and working together to develop indigenous institutions. And every NGO has different sorts of ways of dealing with that. In addition, the NGOs tend, and I think in an extraordinary way, really, have engaged the attention and interests of the American people. We have, World Vision has 1.4 million contributors in the United States. We go to a large number of people. A large number of people know who the major NGOs are. They contribute money, they support them. That means they get educated through us, I hope accurately, perhaps not accurately, but at least they get exposed to what's going on outside the United States. And in that way, I think we broaden the worldview of the American people through the work we do, because when you raise money, you educate people. We have extraordinary, in the aggregate, operational capacity. We employ hundreds of thousands. If you add them all up together, the NGOs probably employ both Western and indigenous people, hundreds of thousands of people to actually do things in the field. And so when something has to get done quickly, or even not quickly, but you have to do a large-scale project of some kind, then there are people to do it. And that's a strength. The weaknesses are, which as an NGO, it's difficult for me to say this, but I put my old hat on just to think back as I was administering things what I saw as weaknesses. First is there is uneven quality. Managerially, some of them are not very well managed. Some of us are not well managed. Some of them are very well managed. So the quality terms in terms of management and accountability, but also in terms of the quality of the program, their understanding of what they're doing. There are NGOs that just dump commodities and leave. There are others that work for 10 years and develop indigenous institutions and do extraordinary work. Second, there is in all of the NGO community, and anyone who says this is not true, I think is being disingenuous with you. There is a great attraction. You ask people why they do things. They'll give you altruistic reasons, but the reality is there is extraordinary attraction for free spirits. The people who ultimately, particularly from the Western world, go and work in complex emergencies. There's an excitement, there's an adventure. There's a rewarding part to it too. But free spirits don't get managed easily. They don't get organized. They don't take doctrines easily and try to implement them. They're not trained easily. So that becomes a problem. And finally, this is the most difficult problem, and something, John, I very much disagree with John's comment about the independence of NGOs. I can tell you they don't take instruction very well. The notion that you can tell them what to do is utter baloney. I tried to do that, and I found them looking at me saying, we're not doing it, we'll take the cash if you want, but we're doing our program the way we want to. And they did. The problem with that is that if you're attempting to create a comprehensive strategy for dealing with a complex emergency, you can't do it. The system is so decentralized that a coherent strategy is almost impossible under the existing system. The UN agencies try to tell NGOs what to do, and we tell them where to go. We have fights constantly with the UN. All the operational agencies do, and it becomes a source of great friction, great tension. And there's tension, frankly, between the NGOs, because they disagree on what needs to be done. And so if you're trying to use development assistance or relief in a complex emergency to move toward a coherent process for peace that any rational person would agree with, it's very difficult to do it because there's so many centers of power that are independent. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next speaker is Julia Taft. She is the president and CEO of Interaction. Interaction is a coalition of U.S. PVOs, or U.S. NGOs, depending which term you use, Previously, as Andrew has mentioned, she was the director of the Office of the U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID from 1988 to 89, or 86 to 89, I guess. She was, prior to that, a consultant to the Department of Defense, where she developed a strategy for utilizing military personnel and resources for humanitarian assistance. She was also, prior to that, acting U.S. coordinator for refugees and director of the State Department's Refugee Bureau. I could go on. As board member of International Rescue Committee, Julia traveled to ex-Yugoslavia earlier this year, and with Interaction representatives did a 10-day assessment of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia to develop recommendations on how to meet the needs of refugees and displaced persons. We welcome Julia.
Thank you very much. I, like Andrew, am not going to give any prepared remarks because I am up here with two of my bosses. Both John and Andrew are on the board of directors of Interaction, and I sometimes disagree with them and will tonight, but I wanted to say a few things about the private voluntary agencies that has not really come across. And I'm not saying it as an advocate. As a matter of fact, you mentioned, I was surprised you mentioned this trip to former Yugoslavia. Not only was I glad to get out alive, but I was, at the time, trying to decide whether or not to even be a contender for the presidency of Interaction. And I thought, after spending 10 days with several of my future board of directors, I wasn't sure I was up to it. But I did take it, and it's really very interesting because while our organization has 154 members, of every organization virtually that you've heard of, but mostly a lot you've never heard of, there is huge diversity on a number of issues. But on some issues, there is a very abiding commitment to do good and do it right. We have seen, though, growing out of the private voluntary agencies, a real understanding or a growing understanding of the issues of relief to development, of the concepts of sustainable development and the relationship of people making their own decisions about their resource allocation and their own economic and social viability. All the grassroots blossoming of civil society is right. We can wax eloquent all night long about all the wonderful things that people can do for themselves. What we're here tonight to talk about is about complex emergencies, where people have been totally disempowered from the ability to make choices about what they want. And part of the challenge to the relief agencies is to help try to recreate systems where they are making choices. And I'd like to give a few examples because I think it shows how there's been some really stunning and creative ways for dealing with relief, even in the midst of huge human suffering, which I think will illustrate the sophistication that some of our agencies do have. And I'd like to talk about Bosnia. When the situation really was disintegrating in Bosnia and the United Nations High Commissioner was assigned the lead responsibility, there was a decision made not only by the UNHCR but also by a private funder, Soros, George Soros, who had a lot of money, that one of the principles for managing the response should be that all assistance, to the extent possible, be funneled through indigenous groups. There's obviously a very strong Catholic Church in Croatia. There's strong Orthodox vehicles in Serbia, and Bosnia had its own Mohammed and other organizations that were there, and there was no reason to bring in a lot of expatriates from other outside sources. Very few agencies from the United States went in. One of the few was the International Rescue Committee. And as a result of their going in, they realized that there were new ways to look at relief because of the the problems of access, which, as you know, have been one of the biggest issues there. There was no way you could bring in externally a lot of relief supplies. So what IRC did was to look within Bosnia at the factory and the production capacity that had stopped to see whether or not the locals could in fact start up their factories and what it might take to start up the factory to produce winterization commodities. Stoves, blankets, plastic sheeting for winterization purposes, etc. And with the assistance from OFTA, started what is one of the most interesting and innovative disaster relief responses, which was regenerating 20 or 30 new factories by providing them resources and the access to some of the raw materials. It put people back to work. They could develop their materials, and you didn't have the problem of internal distribution by externally donated commodities. I could explain a few other things of Bosnia that are good, but most of what's happening in Bosnia is worse than what you even read in the newspaper, although I must say that I think the media has done the best reporting on Bosnia of any disaster I've ever been affiliated with. And they've really tried. And I've been trying to figure out, why is it that the American people are not so outraged that they will force a political and diplomatic leadership role from the United States? And I've been really struggling with this and talking to a lot of people. I can't understand it. Usually we blame the media that they're not covering it, so of course nobody knows about what's going on. In fact, I have a theory that one of the reasons there's no reaction, or the level of political reaction, relates to the question of advocacy. When American PVOs are on the ground and getting shot at and being in harm's way trying to help people with their own survival, they report that trauma back to their churches in the United States. They report it back through their newsletters. When relief workers come back to the United States, they're invited to meetings such as this. There's a real identity. It's not just faces on TV. It's a real identity. And I don't think we should underestimate that one of the problems that we have in Bosnia is that there are virtually no American agencies on the ground. World Vision is going in, or has just gone in. We have 2 or 3 others, and that's it. Now, I don't say it's an either-or situation, that we ought to always have external organizations going in partnership roles. But I think we have to look at what it takes to make the American people react, and it's this identity. I think that's very important. I wanted to talk a little bit about sanctions. I know Mr. Chen, or Dr. Chen, has worked quite a lot on some of the Haiti information on sanctions, and I think it's fair to say this is an area which those of us in the PVO or NGO community are finding increasingly nervous-making. About 3 weeks ago, I get a phone call from some of you who just talked with John Hammack. And John had just come back from Haiti, or I guess I talked with you. John had come back from Haiti and was very concerned about what was being done on trying to get Aristide back. We had a briefing session on what we should do to try to help him get back, and there was a lot of hope. But then he hasn't gone back yet. And one of the techniques, the political techniques, was to try to promote sanctions or ratchet up the sanctions so that the Haitians would hopefully rebel against the military, or the military would find themselves very uncomfortable. Well, I have John on one side, and then the head of CARE calls me on the other side saying, Julia, what's your position on sanctions? We got 700,000 people we can't feed down there because we don't have any more fuel within 2 or 3 weeks. So, being the CEO of this organization has great diversity, I decided to have a meeting to bring in some experts to talk about the question of sanctions. And we met about a week and a half ago with the International Commission on Medical Neutrality and Physicians for Human Rights and quite a large number of our member agencies. And we talked about a variety of unintended consequences of sanctions, and I won't go into all of those now unless you're interested in Q&A. But one of the things that came out in this discussion, which I think is very important for us to keep in mind, is that no matter, now people will criticize some things PVOs do, some things they don't do, but they're there, and they're trying. Okay, they're trying. What we may be finding, though, at the UN is at the Security Council level, much more interest in doing economic sanctions on countries that are creating problems for their own people, rather than really forcing diplomatic solutions and even using peacekeepers. As you know, the United States doesn't like to use peacekeepers because some of our soldiers might get killed. Who is on the front line for sanctions? It's the PVOs. Why are we, you know why we're there, but the fact that we're there and there are humanitarian exemptions usually associated with embargoes and with sanctions, the implication is that the poorest of the poor, or the people who are at the most vulnerable levels of their life, they're going to be taken care of by the PVOs. And let me just tell you, those sanctions don't work for poor people, because if there's an assumption that the PVOs are there that have access to these wonderful commodities that are exempted from sanctions, it just doesn't work. And so we have to be really careful as we look at whether or not we're being a tool for UN Security Council to make very easy political statements when on the ground, the people who are really in contact with those in most need are the PVOs. And I think they're, you know, this is going to be an increasingly important question for all of us as we look at what are the international levers, what are the delivery mechanisms, and it all gets back to politics. Where is the political will to try to do conflict resolution around the world? And until that happens, the PVOs and the NGOs will be out there trying to do their best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. I now would like to introduce Jan Eliason. I don't think I quite have the Swedish swing to that name, who is the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. Jan is a Swedish diplomat and an economist. He has served in many parts of the world. He was the ambassador, the permanent representative of Sweden to the UN. He has been the Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Jan is no stranger to peace and humanitarian matters. From 1980 to 86, he worked with Prime Minister Olof Palme under the UN for settling the Iran-Iraq conflict. In 1991, he chaired the General Assembly Working Group on Emergency Relief. And most importantly, for our purposes, he literally just stepped off the plane directly from Addis Ababa, where he chaired the Somalian Humanitarian Donor Conference. He literally flew in, and we're very grateful to him for that. I should also mention that he's no stranger to Harvard, in that his daughter is a recent graduate, I believe. So.
The title of this seminar should be From Somalia to Cambridge instead of Somalia to Cambodia. I'm glad you didn't say that, something I think Andrew and Julia heard me say about a month ago. In New York, I was introduced by a lady who's finished by saying, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you the man responsible for all disasters in the world." As though I don't have enough. This conference in Somalia was very interesting, and it really touches upon many of the things that I've mentioned here. Andrew, I know, and I personally, and perhaps some of you others were in Somalia, saw the humanitarian nightmare. And in a way, I don't recognize myself being anymore introduced as diplomat, because something has happened when you've seen
what you've seen in Somalia, then there's something else that you'd like to add to it. At least you want to call yourself a humanitarian advocate. But anyway, that conference wasn't anymore about the emergency situation, humanitarian relief. It was actually about rehabilitation and development. What was more interesting was, here we were sitting with the donors, the neighboring countries, the UN family. It is a family after all. And the NGOs international and indigenous. And I think this is very important to build those two together. Also to see to it that the international NGOs don't stay forever, but really just help people go in the direction that they themselves decide to go. But of course, then there were also other aspects which show what kind of world we are living in. Every attention on that conference, as you might have seen from CNN and BBC, was whether IDID would come or not. I wasn't really interested whether IDID was going to be there or not. People asked me, I said, it's up to the Somalis to decide who should come to this conference. And then we would deal with the issues that we were there to work with. And we had actually a wonderful declaration coming out of that meeting last night, with or without IDID. I hope IDID feels responsibility for his own people and accepts these principles that we accepted last night. But no attention was given to the substance of our meeting. The CNN factor, I don't know. Now, I think we need to see this a little bit in a wider perspective, the role of the NGOs and also the role of the UN. Because the whole change, in my view, is based on the changing international environment, which puts us in the direction of now dealing with the civil wars. I think you are right. I think it was John or Andrew said that, no, Andrew said that we will have this for some time. These complex emergencies, in my view, are there for a long period. We are actually paying the price for the end of the Cold War. We are paying the price, which is a good thing, of course, for the forces of democratization that is now breaking out. We are going to see religious and ethnic, cultural explosions all over the place because these forces were held back. It's like a wet blanket that's being lifted away, and now these forces dry up and they explode in our face, and we will see that for a long time. This means that we are living in a new world. We have new challenges. It's not the classical role of the UN getting into a conflict or NGOs getting into a conflict after the conflict is over. And normally it's been an international conflict. You stay at a border. Now we are supposed to cross the border. It's a great sign. Remember, we didn't even think that we could go into Idi Amin's Uganda or Pol Pot's genocide. This was almost accepted. There was sovereignty and non-interference. Now at least we still ask the question, how do we get in? At least on humanitarian action. Not yet on human rights, I must say. But on humanitarian action, we definitely now can put that question. So I think the UN role, and I think partly this is relevant also for the NGOs, has changed in three respects. We have asked to be more active. We don't stop at the border. We are supposed to cross the border. Our role is also more comprehensive because we are inside. We're just not only then peacekeepers, but we are also dealing with the political processes, elections, political reconciliation, and humanitarian, providing relief. This is also reflected in Security Council resolution these days. It's a new thing because we have to enter the area of internal affairs. Thirdly, our role has become more exposed, physically and politically. When you are in there, while conflict goes on, you take risks. You take physical risks, you take political risks. And that we see, both from the UN side and the NGO side. Now, we have been given a new tool, in my view. A new tool for the, whether it is disorder or world disorder or order, but I think humanitarian action. And you notice I avoid the term humanitarian intervention. Intervention is a very sensitive word in the UN. If I want to keep the consensus on our activities, I talk about humanitarian assistance, humanitarian action. Intervention is still giving the impression of an outside force coming in and interfering. And we still have to be careful with that, although we have made progress. But I think we've been given a new tool, a tool of which could turn into, in my view, not only a tool of helping people in need, and for that I feel very, very strongly, but also a diplomatic tool. With this tool, we can negotiate humanitarian corridors, we can arrange meetings like the one these past 3 days about humanitarian assistance. I don't think we could have brought those people there under any other pretext, and they haven't, by the way, yet met fully yet anyway. But this is a tool in our hand which we now can use. And I think even if we have problems of coordination, and I agree with John on that, this tool is there to stay. And I think without this coordination tool, without this humanitarian diplomacy, United Nations would be very poor. Now, what has happened, and I think this is very important for the subject of this evening, is that we now have, of course, the integration of political, peacekeeping, and humanitarian in our Security Council resolutions, which means that humanitarian assistance action has to go on side by side with a peacekeeping operation and with a political reconciliation process. Look at Somalia, for instance. Now, normally this is okay. I am a great believer in finally the Security Council putting human beings in the center, saying that the suffering of human beings is a threat against international peace and security. Why didn't we ever realize that that was so in the past? Why is it so revolutionary that we finally put that in the Security Council resolution? That is, to me, the most civilized conclusion, by the way, at the end of the Cold War, that we finally stopped looking at nations as pawns in a geopolitical chess game, and rather as societies with human beings who have a right of economic and social well-being and, of course, political freedom. Now, these three dimensions usually live well together. I would say I have wonderful examples of how it can work very well, like in Mozambique, where things are going very well today, where the humanitarian action really is a contribution to security. I agree with Julia that, of course, we need to have the political solutions, but in a very interesting, dynamic way, also by humanitarian action, we can provide contributions to security by building roads, by opening schools, by taking away mines, by giving jobs to the technicals in Somalia. We are enhancing security. And I must say, and I said so publicly this summer, it gave me a bit of a headache inside the building, that I find it very questionable that we are in a situation where our programs in Somalia cost 1/10 of the military protection. The original purpose why we went there costs 1/10 of the military protection, $166 million vis-a-vis $1.5 billion. And I wanted to point at the risk of forgetting the original purpose while we were there. Now, the problem is, of course, when peacekeeping goes into peace enforcement, when we become a part of a conflict, and when we have a situation where our people in the humanitarian community, including the NGOs, are worried about being associated with the military side of the UN. There, of course, we have to come back to the basic principles of delivery of humanitarian relief. And this goes for both the NGOs and the UN agency. And that is impartiality, neutrality, humanity. And to stick to those principles as hard as possible. I know it might sound idealistic, because it's not easy to do that if you have to go through ID territory or Karadzic territory or whatever it is. But I think it's absolutely essential that we say that we are committed to reaching the human being in need. We are not playing politics with this. If I compromise on that and start to say, well, we'll give to you but not to you, we'll give you 3 weeks, we'll give you 2 weeks, where do we end? To me, you are on a moral slippery slope, which I don't accept being on. And by the way, also more pragmatically and in a more tough-minded way, I can't go to Khartoum and to tell General Bashir that I want to reach the southern part of Sudan if he can prove that I played politics with that assistance somewhere else. In other words, neutrality is absolutely essential, especially when peacekeeping goes into peace enforcement. Personally, I would hope that UN would do less of that in the future. Now, consent. Normally, there is a need for consent for both UN and NGOs. NGOs otherwise, of course, take risks. I must say I admire the NGOs, because they can take that risk. We do not have to have the consent if we have a Chapter 7 basis for our action. If the Security Council has decided to use Chapter 7, where you sanctions the military force if possible. And that is used much more now when the veto is not used anymore. But if there is no Security Council resolution, we are building the work on the resolution that created my office. Maybe I should have been more careful when I did that job description, by the way, because I was chairman of that committee. Because then there it is really a consent. You have to have consent. And that is for us a must. But I must say I admire the NGOs. For instance, northern Iraq. They go in, via Turkey, and I do my job as Undersecretary of Humanitarian Affairs with the program. But I'm very glad that some of the goods needed are coming other directions and where the NGOs go in there. But they actually take physical risks with this. And this they must be aware of. And I know it, and it's a division of labor, not a conscious one, but I see it happen and I understand it. I would probably do the same if I were in their clothes. I can't resist saying something about sanctions. You shouldn't prolong this too much, but my view on this is that this is the instrument given by the Security Council, by the Charter of the United Nations, as a means of getting change. It's Chapter 7, before you get into military operations. My view from my perspective is that sanctions is a blunt instrument. It needs to be more refined. We need to find means of seeing that the effects are more surgical, because there are too many people that are paying a very heavy price for sanctions. I've seen it in Haiti, I've seen it in Iraq, I've seen it in Serbia, and other parts, and by the way, Western Bosnia. I think there is a need, in order to make that instrument credible also among many member states now, to see to it that it really is designed in such a way that it affects those whom we want to hit. That's my only comment on that. On NGOs, last point. The NGOs are doing a great job in several respects. First of all, as Andrew said, it's a lot of money, $2-3 billion, I think, in the world, through the NGOs to humanitarian relief operations. Secondly, I'm impressed going around the world to see where they are doing the job. Sudan, Somalia, out there in the firing line, out there in the villages, handing out the goods, and Oxfam in Cambodia taking away mines. Fantastic. So they are doing operational work, also for us, through the agencies and programs. Thirdly, I think they are doing, but they could even do more in early warning, because they are out there in villages. They could tell us what's going on, and we could use that better. Peacemaking, I don't know. Possibly, if you look at the Carter Center, it's interesting because there a private party can play a more informal role. And we need to work much more informally now with conflict resolution. The classical diplomats are not, it's not enough. You need now people who know culture, history, religion, psychology, psychiatry, anything. You have to be a Leonardo da Vinci, actually. And that requires a broader division of work. And therefore, I think a Carter Center, an NGO, could play a role of getting people together. It's not a coincidence that this Norwegian group that brought the PLO and Israel together was such a group. So here, I think, is an opening. I'm not quite sure, Mary, about safe zones, because that's a very tough thing where you really have to have geographic limitations, time zones, and be sure that it works. But if you give me a good example, I would be interested to discuss that. Last thing, it's slightly sentimental, but I must say so. I am very worried about a lot of countries, especially the rich countries now, being in the direction of looking inwards. I see, as a European, strange phenomena, political phenomena, but also attitudes that are changing in a, to me, pretty scary way. I see signs of xenophobia, I see signs of growing bias, we see isolationism. Let's hope for the euro go around, it's important, it's very, very important. But there are all these trends of looking inward and thinking that, well, the solution is, take care of yourself and don't think about the outside. And there I am reminded of good old Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet. There is a world outside Verona. And that if we don't realize that the whole idea of internationalism, the whole idea of United Nations, the whole idea of what you here are working for, and both, I think, from the perspectives of you who study here and the NGOs, is that we are in this together. And that this idea is built not only of the classical justice and solidarity theme, which was the basis for support of the United Nations and the internationalism in the past, but also on security and enlightened self-interest. If that thought could finally prevail, that the idea of internationalism is not based only on the classical appeal to the left and liberals, but also to the others who realize that, my God, it's the security, the future of their children. If the belief of the United Nations could be built on those two pillars, then I think we are in business. But if we go the direction of closing ourselves out, looking at foreign policy and domestic policy as completely apart, in a world where immigration and environment, all these issues, of course, make absolutely clear that they are together and this interdependence. That's why the NGOs are so important, because they remind the world about the world outside Verona. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, especially for the sentiment and the rallying call at the end. Before I open up the floor, we have one very distinguished guest in our midst who I would like to call on for a comment or a question. This is Peter Cyrus, who is the Director of Public Policy Liaison at Catholic Relief Services. Peter, if you would like, come. Yes, come, please.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief because I know we want to get on to other questions. Reflecting on what all the panelists have said, it strikes me that the response to complex emergencies is as complex as the emergencies themselves. And just making a list of some of the things that were touched on here and some of the things which were not touched on includes the complexity of immediately saving lives, providing appropriate interventions, acting in a neutral, impartial way, gaining access in difficult security situations, acting early, quickly, but prudently, understanding local culture, the environment, etc. Then NGOs and other relief agencies are asked to promote rehabilitation or not to undermine long-term development. Again, a whole series of issues which relates to that particular aspect of our work. Third, promoting reconciliation or not at least fueling or exacerbating the conflict is another increasingly important part of our work when we deal with conflict situations. Making sure that food we provide to the civilian population does not support the insurgency which may be going on directly or indirectly. In addition to that, working with the military in situations where military forces are involved, dealing with questions of sovereignty, becoming mediators and negotiators. So my question, and I go back to something Mary Anderson said in the beginning, which is to do good and do no harm. Perhaps we need to think of doing more good than harm we do, because I think there are inevitably trade-offs that are made in all of these questions. My question is, in what ways do any of you have suggestions on either ways in which the professionalism of the NGO community can be enhanced to deal with this vast array of issues, or do we need to think more in terms of a division of labor and more specialization? I think the International Committee of the Red Cross has been extremely effective because they have carved out a very narrow but incredibly crucial mandate for themselves. Should NGOs be thinking more in those terms, or can we pretend to deal with the vast array of issues that are before us?
Who would like to try the first cut at Peter's? Julia?
Well, I would agree that there's great room for improvement. My suggestion would be to start maybe with the 10 or 15 mega PVOs that always are going to be involved or are typically involved in conflict situations. World Vision, Catholic Relief Service, the Red Cross and its affiliates, some of the other church groups. There are about 10 or 15. And I think we need to agree amongst ourselves before we start going and negotiating with the UN and the peacekeepers on how to take care of us or provide security. We need to make sure we all agree to a code of conduct, the kind of conduct principles that came out of Providence and are being promoted by the ICRC. We need to agree on data collection and assessments. That gets to the point on sanctions. We're all out there, and a lot of the agencies are there before the disaster. They ought to be able to have some baseline data so we know what the early warning signals are. I think we need joint training and commitments to joint training and carving out roles and responsibilities. There's no reason we should all be trying to rush in and do the same sectoral response. This is a professional operation, and lives are at stake. And any of you who've served on boards of directors of a private voluntary agency and has seen any of their staff members go into Bosnia without helmets and armored cars, you may have some liability as the head of the board of directors or on the board of directors. I mean, we're sending people in some serious places. They need to be trained. They need to be really very clear on what they're there for. So I would like to see either a secretariat that maybe DHA could help us start, or we could get some funding, because Interaction has international affiliates with all of these organizations as well. I'm not suggesting Interaction do it, but it ought to be where we set forth some real guidelines and some contingency plans, because this problem is going to be with us for a very long time.
Anyone else on this question?
No question.
Yes.
Could I
Or-
just add a
yeah, add a
just one,
comment.
I don't disagree with Julia, just one word of caution. I worry, I guess, that we over-professionalize. I clearly see the need for professionalization, but we're dealing with very poor people who you want to empower. It's them that you want to empower. And the key thing to learn to empower people is not really your technical expertise, it's your capacity to listen and your capacity not to take the credit. That's what we have to train people on, not professionalism or whatever that is.
We welcome questions, more questions and comments and brief ones from the floor, and you should go perhaps to the mics. Yes. And you can address them to one of the panelists or to the panel at large.
My name is Phil Villers, and my question is for Julia Taft, and others may want to comment too. We've been talking about the role of the UN and the NGOs in complex situations involving peacemaking and reconstruction. And I would like to ask, what should be the role in a particular situation which is getting very acute? I'm talking about Salvador, where after long fighting, peace seemed to be at hand and is now threatened by a combination of the return of the death squads with impunity, the national police in contradiction of the peace accords not being dissolved, and hundreds of thousands of prospective voters not being allowed to register. What should be the role of the NGOs and, for that matter, of Interaction in such a situation?
I'll just say a couple of words about it. John is really the Interaction expert on El Salvador, and I think he should comment. Let me just say that this is the kind of question that we don't really have any clarity about how we relate to the UN about it. There's been an establishment under Jan's office actually the ECOSOC did it, the Interagency Standing Committee on Humanitarian Assistance. It has the heads of all the specialized agencies, the head of UNHCR, head of WFP, head of UNDP, WHO, UNICEF, and it's chaired by DHA. Interaction is a full member of that, as is the Red Cross, as is another coordinating body in Europe of NGO activities. It is a forum, but we haven't really been able to use it for getting commitments and information and action on early warnings because there's so many other things going on. And I think this is a real issue. You could say El Salvador, somebody else will say Zaire. We've got all kinds of problems that have not yet reached the focal point of real collaboration, and I think we just have to work on it. But I don't have any, there's no mechanism other than through the media. And again, this is what grabs attention. We've got to get more coverage on these kinds of situations in the media, and then our politicians will listen, and the Security Council may listen. But that's my thought. John, did you want to maybe say anything?
I think, Phil, you have an interaction as 150 odd groups. They're very, very different. And I think their position on advocacy, because it is an advocacy issue primarily right now. El Salvador is primarily an advocacy issue to try to get the United Nations to do an independent investigation, which is an advocacy issue with the Salvadorian government to allow it to happen. Most US NGOs are unwilling, even though there's movement towards doing more advocacy, there is still an unwillingness on the part of many NGOs to get very involved in what are perceived as political and not humanitarian issues, even though, of course, from my point of view, they're not, from everything I just said. But I think it's very difficult. So the way Interaction solves that is that if Oxfam's interested in something like this, it starts to work on something, and then maybe 5 other groups, or 10 or 20 or 50 might join it. In something like this, it would be a small group, quite a small group, I think.
Yes.
Julie Fisher from Program on Nonprofit Organizations at Yale University. No one's talked about population tonight. And I want to because I've been studying indigenous NGOs for about 5 years. And my optimism vis-a-vis indigenous NGOs, and I'm not even talking about international ones here, which is another, is continually overcome by my pessimism about the sheer increase in numbers that we're facing. Is it possible that what you talked about, Andrew, about the increasing number of these humanitarian crises is not just a short-term effect of the Cold War, that when we get beyond the immediate post-war Cold War period, we may be facing increasing numbers because of the population resource poverty pressures on the one hand, and because of some of the psychological impacts which we don't even really understand about overcrowding and stress, which may mean that the whole security peacekeeping issue gets worse and worse as well. So I would really like any or all of you to comment on that particular take on it.
Andrew.
Let me make a few comments because I did an article on Somalia, and when I gave it to Jonathan Moore, who used to be the director here at the Institute, to read, he said, "It's one thing you haven't done, Andrew. You haven't told us why, other than the Cold War ending. The reason that all these conflicts are taking place is not because the Cold War ended. That was an immediate cause. It was the match that lit the gasoline. But who put the gasoline there?" And I sat down and started thinking of all of the conflicts I've been to. Why are these things happening? We have had the most massive population movements for economic reasons, not just for
Demographic.
for violence or political reasons in the history of the world in the last 50 years, 40 years. And it's because of population growth rates that are absolutely astronomical in societies that can't environmentally sustain it. Somalia is a good example of that. Somalia imported in the best days of its agricultural production before Barry collapsed, the Barry regime collapsed, 50%, in a good year, 50% of its food was imported. And I kept saying, how did they survive before there was aid? Well, the reason is 20 years ago, there wasn't that many people. If you look at the population of Ethiopia, the same thing, massive population increase in the last 30, 40 years, and they can't sustain people in that population. And the second thing that's happening beyond the population movements, looking for jobs and being forced off land, is ethnic groups that have hated each other for a long time have been moved very close together, because there are more of them, and they're now bumping up against each other, and the conflict is increasing dramatically. And when you have populations that are under a lot of stress and that are at risk because of the inability to support themselves under good circumstances, let alone when there's a drought or when there's a tribal war or ethnic conflict or something, then you have all the recipe for a real catastrophe. So it is a critical problem. I must tell you, the Christian NGOs, regardless of which one, always have to look at the issue of population, how to do that and all that. And we made a decision at World Vision to start working actively worldwide in the area of population, and you know, we haven't had our contributors very upset, but we had our big forum last year and early this year, the day I started, in Washington, to discuss the issue ethically and how to do it in a way that was sensitive within the church community worldwide and the local culture. And it's been working, but it's very difficult to do. It's not an easy thing to change people's cultural and social biases on the issue.
Jan, you wanted to say
Yeah,
Mary as well.
after 2 years in this job and 1 year preparing it, it might sound paradoxical, but being responsible for emergencies makes you think more than ever about root causes. We are like firemen working day shift and night shift, and I intensely think about how much more we need to do about prevention and the root causes of the problems. If you look now at where we're spending money on in the UN, it's more or less the symptom side. It's the peacekeeping when the crisis has developed into what we see all around the world, and it's humanitarian. The development, population outlays and spending is the same. But the big increase is dealing with the symptoms, not with the root causes. And I'm very worried about that. If you look at the big problem of refugees and displaced persons, you have 18 million refugees and 26 almost displaced person, refugees inside countries, 45 million. My guess is that it would very well go up to 60 million before the end of this century. Why? More ethnic and religious conflict. Yes, of course, we talked about this here, but what are the other reasons? Population increase, 97 million people a year. Environmental degradation, droughts. Chernobyl could happen too by the moving a lot of people. Technological disasters. And poverty, of course, poverty, economic movement. So if we don't deal with these root causes, we're just going to have to get the pressures onto us here. So your question is very well put, and I think it's a very important reminder that brings back John's basic point that we have to deal with root causes. And this is one of the most important ones.
Could I add one?
Mary wants to, and I think then we should probably open it up to at least a couple of other questions. We've already run over our time. So Mary, quickly, and then we'll have
Just a couple
come
of
up
points
to the mics.
supporting what went before me, and in particular congratulating you on reminding us to go back to causes, as Jan just said. It seems to me that the other issue that Jan just raised, that we're spending so much time on symptoms, shows how important it is that we make the connection between the way in which we respond to those symptoms, since they need to be responded to instantly, and those linkages back into development and into peace. How can we do that in a way that, rather than making it worse, makes it better? And that's what we're really trying to ask. One thing that we just have to grapple with in our notion about the issue you raised of the population resource base is the following, and that is it's seldom the very poor people who start or perpetuate wars. It is people who are better off who tend to gain from and support and start and perpetuate wars. And that's a mystery to it. I mean, you know, if you take the population pressures, you would think, aha, the poor people are out to get what they get. That's not who starts them. So that's an issue that we have to look at much more carefully and understand the dynamics there. And then finally, I think that one of the issues when you have population pressures and resource constraints that is very heavily laid on outside aid givers is the following, and that is to introduce resources into the situation of any sort, development resources or humanitarian assistance resources, will not automatically solve that problem. That is to say, in situations where there are power differences in access to resources, it tends to be people who are more powerful who get access to those resources. It creates its own dynamic for tension and for competition, and that's why it's so important we think of harder about how we deliver the resources in those situations, not just whether to deliver them or how many or so on, but the processes by which we deliver them matter so much in terms of whether we're exacerbating those tensions or actually alleviating them.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is, I'm Washuka Ikua from Kenya. Just looking at this is my contact with my country, begging. I've spent the last 10 years of my career doing the same, begging. I don't enjoy it. There's no pride in receiving aid, and there's no joy. There's a lot of humiliation a lot of times, as I experienced in Paris in 1991, when Kenya was put on hold. But the reality is we come from those countries. And right now, in this article, my minister is asking for $200 million to feed Kenyans. If the 1.5 million tons that they're asking for is not available, somebody or people in Kenya are likely to die. He's asking for another 20 million to replace or to resettle what I refuse to call ethnic clashes. And that's what it's widely called. I call them political victims. As we are talking today, somebody somewhere, thousands of people are living in schools, are living in poverty because of maybe the price for democratization, price for human rights, I don't know. But the truth is, that's the reality. And if that does not come, there'll be no long run for them. It's only short run. So whatever we do, we, as the people who are begging, would like to be made independent. We would like to stop this begging. And I really appreciate what Mr. Hammack was saying. We would like to be able to participate in empowering us, in making us not beggars, but participants in our own country. We have seen our countries reduced from to food importers while they were actually self-sufficient in food production. We would like to see that retained, sustained again. And we ask you, those of you who are committed to do it, to help us in doing it, not to continue as beggars.
One more question, unfortunately, because our time is out.
My name is Hunter Farnham, and I've worked with many of you people in the past, both in government and with NGOs. And I have a question. I just wanted to congratulate the Kennedy School on this panel. I think it reflects not only the diversity on the issue, but also is good to see many familiar faces here. The question I have is that in looking for indigenous models, I've always been struck from a distance by the success that the Eritreans had with the Eritrean Relief Commission. And whether it was working on relief issues, the movement of masses of people from the east over to the west and into Sudan, or on development issues, the Eritreans always seem to have a sense of a purpose and a method of accomplishing this. At the same time, some of the NGOs that are active now are also doing this on an indigenous level in conflict situations. I think particularly of International Medical Corps' success in Afghanistan, working with the Mujahideen, ending up having begun with one clinic in 1984 and now turning over to an entire operation of 3 hospitals, 60 clinics, EPI programs in 18 provinces, with a program that's been run by the Afghans, with only 1 or 2 expatriates doing administrative work. What are we learning from this sort of thing? How can we apply this to help us dealing with the humanitarian crises and helping these people who should be the goals and the objectives of what we're trying to do to help these people get on with their lives? How can we get this the political attention it deserves, so that Tex Goldschmidt's line about the least important political issue drives out the most important economic issue becomes the least important economic issue overrides or is integrated with the political issue, and we achieve what we're trying to accomplish. Who wants to handle that one?
Yes, Julie?
Well, I'll try until you got to pontificate there, Hunter. Hunter was working with me back in 87 when, or actually I guess it was 1988, when in fact the relief effort in northern Ethiopia, but Eritrea at that time, was blocked by Mengistu's people. And a big decision had to be made by the PVOs as to whether or not they would turn over all of their assets to indigenous relief groups that were above the line. And there were some organizations that said, no, we don't trust the indigenous groups, you remember, and they locked their warehouses, they took the keys from their trucks, and I'm not going to mention the name of these organizations because 2 of them are very important ones and big ones. And they stopped. Well, all the rest, I was off at the time, and we said, oh gosh, the whole thing, everybody's going to starve to death. Well, you know what? They did just fine. By the trusting factor that was there, and making sure the assistance was made available, but they did all the distribution, they did all the monitoring, it was great. Unfortunately, I must say, the same people who were managing that on the Eritrean side are now managing Ethiopia, and I think they have forgotten how to be very sensitive and empowering of the diversity of the rest of Ethiopia. There are going to be some real problems there, and that raises a question about what kinds of values do we have with our, what do we try to inculcate when people are in refugee camps about equity, about respect for women, about participation of refugees in the design of their programs. We have many situations. There's supposed to be 20 big major repatriations this decade. I would say that there's virtually no effective training before these people go back that is going to be culturally appropriate and transportable and really used in the country where they're going to go back to. And some of these people have been in camps for 10, 20 years, and it's a wonderful opportunity to do some real development training and sensitivity, and we miss that. We miss the ideas about democracy, and we miss the ideas about equity and political sharing. In refugee camps, it's very hierarchical, and it's a real problem. So it doesn't answer your question, but it's great to see you again.
Mary, short comment, and then we will have to
I
close.
have one sentence to add, which also doesn't answer your question, but you're raising that question. One of the answers is clearly that even though they were an effective model, they did fundraise and resource raise from outside. That is to say that they really did need outside support, but they managed it, which Julia just said. And I want to link back to our Kenyan woman who just a moment ago spoke, and just say that it's important that we make a distinction between begging and fundraising. And you're right that begging is humiliating, but we should not assume that just because we're helping transfer money that the people on the other end are beggars. They can be fundraisers, and my best example of that are the halls we sit in. Harvard is never considered a beggar, but it is a vigorous fundraiser.
Just to say thank you very much to this excellent and diverse panel, to say that we started with complexity. I think we also understood along the way that we're dealing with magnitude, and we're dealing not just with complexity of crises, but complexity of institutional players, complexity of linkages between relief, development, peace, politics. And I was very happy to hear that we were also talking about people. And although I did hear hints that perhaps people were the cause of the problem, I also heard very loudly that people had to be involved and were really part of the solution. And I want to thank you all very much